Okay. Hi, welcome. Welcome to our program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Today's symposium is titled Using Systematic Review to Evaluate Population-Level Dose Toxicity from Endocrine Active Chemicals. My name is Rita Locke-Caruso. I'm a professor of public health, toxicology in our Department of Environmental Health Sciences here at the University of Michigan. Since you have the real me, you don't need that terrible picture, right? When I was so tired. I'm also director of the Michigan Center on Life-Stage Environmental Exposures and Disease, which we call M-LEEaD for obvious reasons, shorter. M-LEEaD is a National Institute of Health, NIEHS-funded center that supports research, career development, and community engagement in environmental health sciences with pilot projects, seminars, course support, and more. If you are interested in environmental health research, I encourage you to look us up. Our center is co-hosting today's event with the Department of Environmental Health Science. Today's program is second in a series in which we bring current events from public health practice into our research center. The professional practice of public health is vitally important to all of our. With over 8,000 high production volume chemicals currently in U.S. commercial use, chemical exposures are inevitable and widespread. Many environmental chemicals have important occupational exposures also. The good news is that many of these exposures and their risks are avoidable. At our first symposium last year, we learned about an update to a key environmental statute, specifically the 2016 Lautenberg Amendments to the Toxic Substances and Control Act, or TSCA, which gives the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency greater authority to modernize the risk evaluation procedures. This new law, passed with bipartisan support, is the first national environmental statute update in over 20 years. The Lautenberg Amendments to TSCA set the stage for today's topic. Now, more than ever, we need to discuss scientific data about the relationships between environmental contaminants and human health. I am delighted that we'll be hearing from a distinguished panel about recent developments in chemical pollutant policy. Today's panel will focus on endocrine active chemicals. The endocrine system is that chemical messaging system in our bodies comprised of organs and hormones that regulate reproduction, development, metabolism, growth, sleep, mood, and so much more. Research about how environmental chemicals affect the endocrine system has received a lot of attention in recent years. Today, I think we still have somebody squeaking in. Today, we will consider the question, what is the best way to integrate evidence on endocrine disrupting chemicals? Evidence that comes from a variety of approaches, including toxicological studies with cells and animal models, and epidemiologic studies of people. The National Academies of Sciences took up this and other important questions to advise the U.S. EPA as they implement the new TSCA amendments and their other responsibilities to assess the science. I look forward to hearing about this from our panelists. Now, I get the pleasure of introducing Dr. Trish Coleman, who organized this event. My colleague, Dr. Coleman, is a researcher at the School of Public Health and is our M-LEEaD Center scientist. Before coming to the University of Michigan, Trish spent many years at the U.S. EPA as an environmental scientist, so she brings both a policy and scientific perspective to her research and to this event. Trish. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Caruso, and welcome everyone, especially those of you who are watching on the webinar. And so I want to, again, thank both the M-LEEaD Center and our Department of Environmental Health Sciences for sponsoring today's event. All right, and get to the next slide. Great. So having programs like this helps our scientists stay abreast of a lot of important public health practice activities that are going on. and to have interactions with leading scientists here on campus. An important National Academies report entitled The Application of Systematic Review Methods in Overall Strategy for Evaluating Low-Dose Toxicity from Endocrine Active Chemicals. It's a mouthful in terms of the title, but a really important building block for a lot of the important work in protecting public health that will be going forward. This was released in July of 2017 and highlights several important issues related to systematic review, chemical hazard and risk assessment, and policy making, which are essential to the implementation of the Lautenberg amendments that Dr. Caruso mentioned to the Toxic Substance Control Act. So we have 3 members of the NAS committee, Dr. David Dorman from North Carolina State University, and who is also the committee chair. We have Dr. Weihsueh Chiu from Texas A&M, who will be on the video link as well, and Andy Rooney, who's here with us today, will provide an overview of the report and discuss implications for hazard and chemical assessment at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We're also very fortunate to have with us Dr. Julian Lam from the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Lam recently published a systematic review of polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are in flame retardants, and looking at childhood neurological outcomes related to those exposures. So this landmark National Academies report will help the U.S. EPA grapple with risk assessment methods for exposures at levels people routinely encounter in the environment to potential endocrine disrupting chemicals. The committee presented recommendations to EPA regarding the design, conduct, and use of systematic review and meta-analysis approaches that has implications for how the agency proceeds with its chemical assessments, in particular under TSCA. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our first speaker, Dr. David Dorman, who is joining us on the webinar by phone from North Carolina. Dr. Dorman is a professor of toxicology in the Department of Molecular Biosciences of North Carolina State University. He received his undergraduate training from the University of San Diego and his DVM from Colorado State University. He completed a PhD and residency program in toxicology at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and he has chaired or served on numerous National Research Council committees, and he has also served on advisory boards for the U.S. Navy, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and much more. He is a former member of the National Toxicological Program Board of Scientific Counselors, and he was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Toxicological Sciences and a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. And so I want to welcome Dr. Dorman by phone, and I hope you'll begin your remarks, please.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in attendance today. There in Michigan. I spent quite a bit of my life in the Midwest. I grew up in Wisconsin, so I always enjoy going back to the Midwest, but you caught me on a day when I was teaching quite a bit for the vet students here. So one of my roles is to kind of kick off a background about the report that several folks have already talked about, that Dr. Coleman talked about. One thing I want to point out is that the report's actually downloadable for free at the National Academy website. So if you just look for this title, which is actually quite long, you can readily download the PDF and read the report at your leisure in the future here. Next slide, please. So the National Academy report on low-dose endocrine effects did not occur in a vacuum, and there had been several antecedent reports that National Academies had developed over the last 5 to 6 years or so that led to the genesis of this report. So back in 2011, the National Academy was asked to review an IRIS document for formaldehyde, and in that review of that chemical, there was a number of recommendations that occurred in what was then known as Chapter 7 of that formaldehyde National Academy report that spelled out some strong recommendations that the US EPA IRIS program should move forward with adopting and applying systematic review methods and similar methods to risk assessment questions. The US Congress actually mandated the EPA to try to develop and adopt as many of those Chapter 7 recommendations, which then led to a follow-up report that the National Academies performed in 2014, where a second committee was asked to review the progress that had been made by the IRIS program. And indeed, there's now a third committee, which met as a workshop back in February of 2018, just a few months ago, that related to further advancements that have occurred since that last 2014 review. So I actually have served on all three of these committees, so I've been able to watch the genesis of the risk assessment process within the IRIS program and how they've been adopting systematic review. So our effort that was going on with low-dose endocrine was also informed by a separate group of committees that had looked at non-monotonic dose relationships and had reviewed a state of the science evaluation that was performed by EPA back in 2014. Next slide, please. So for those of you that may or may not be that familiar with the National Academy process, what's really important to understand is that within the National Academy process, we have an independent, unpaid, pro bono committee of experts that serve on these committees. So this shows you the faces of all of the members of our committee. We had individuals from academia, individuals from industry, and individuals from national laboratories with a variety of different backgrounds in epidemiology, toxicology, chemical risk assessment, systematic review methodologies, and we had veterinarians, physicians, a whole gamut of different folks that were serving on this committee. So I first off want to thank everyone that were my committee member that you were not able to meet. You'll be meeting Dr. Chiu and also Dr. Rooney here in a few minutes, but this was a multi-person effort to develop this report. Next slide, please. And so the statement of task for all National Academy committees in which a report is going to be generated, the sponsor and National Academies works together to try to develop a statement of task. And that statement of task kind of guides the discussion of the committee and really kind of formulates a way in which the committee is going to do its work. And so the abbreviated statement of task, what we were asked to do is, first of all, develop a strategy EPA could use to try to evaluate endocrine effects on human and animal populations. We were asked to look at dose-response relationships as they related to several different chemicals. And importantly, one of the things that we were also asked to do, though, was to actually go beyond just recommending systematic reviews, but actually independently perform systematic reviews of both animal and human evidence. And in the statement of task, they didn't spell out the specific chemicals we had to work with, but they wanted us to work with chemicals that could affect the estrogen, androgen, or other endocrine systems. Then they wanted us to demonstrate how systematic reviews could be used to collect data and also to help draw inferences about causality. So after much deliberation on the part of the committee, we ended up settling in on phthalates and effects on male reproductive tract development, and flame retardants, the PBDEs, and effects on neurobehavioral development and function in animals and in humans. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we did within the committee's strategy, which is published within the report, is we tried to break down the processes that EPA might use in order to identify whether or not a chemical could have low-dose endocrine effects. We also were trying to understand how would the EPA actually bring a chemical into the risk assessment process. And so, for example, one of the important things that we always have to consider is when you're putting in a lot of energy to do systematic reviews, we're trying to do different investigations that oftentimes is being driven by a public health concern. So our process that we showed and illustrated to EPA begins with an arm of surveillance in which we feel that the agency should be actively looking at a variety of different types of data sources, informational sources in which it can try to make a determination that a chemical of interest may have a public health concern related to low-dose endocrine effects. Once that surveillance program is completed, the EPA should then be able to formulate and develop some approach to investigation. What you'll see in the mid-slide here, underneath investigation and analysis, systematic review plays an important role within the investigation process. But what's also important, one of the things our committee tried to stress was that systematic review is just one of several different ways EPA could actually tackle a question about low-dose endocrine effects. After these investigations and analyses are completed, then that information should help inform different types of actions. And one thing that's important is that oftentimes actions that are made by the agency that could range from banning a chemical to changing the way a chemical might be used in commerce in the United States and other types of outcomes, those are oftentimes policy decisions, and the policy decision making rests with EPA and the federal government. So giving recommendations about policy changes is actually beyond the charge of our committee, but our committee recognized that investigation and analysis should lead to some type of outcomes and different types of action. Next slide, please. So for those of you that aren't entirely familiar with phthalates and issues related to phthalate male reproductive effects, we had settled in on male reproductive effects for a couple of reasons. One was when we were surveying the literature, when we were doing our scoping exercise, we felt that there was sufficient information about effects in both humans and also in animals. So going back to our charge, that was a critical element of our charge, that we evaluate chemicals to look at data streams from both animals and humans. Within both humans and animals, there's a phthalate syndrome, which is recognized. The phthalate syndrome has several different parts to it. It has changes in anogenital distance. It has changes in penile structure in which hypospadia can occur. There's changes in fetal testosterone that can occur. So our systematic reviews of that literature looked for evidence along those three endpoints. So could a phthalate change fetal testosterone? Was it linked to hypospadia? Could it alter anogenital distance in male offspring that were exposed in utero? We developed strategic protocols for the systematic reviews. Those were peer-reviewed. And then we adopted a methodology that OHAT in National Toxicology Program developed several years ago, kind of the blueprint for how we would perform our systematic reviews. Next slide.
Please do not have their phone on mute, so if you could please mute your line. Thank you.
So in the second chemical that we looked at was the flame retardants, the polybrominated diethyl ethers. And so the PBDEs, what we were looking for there was developmental exposures and neurobehavioral effects. And as you'll hear from Dr. Julian Lam later, she had her group and Tracy Woodruff's group had already been looking at IQ effects. And one of the things that we wanted to do is illustrate to the EPA that they could take pre-existing systematic reviews, update them, and actually apply it, that they didn't have to whole cloth always come up with a brand new systematic review of the evidence. So what we did was an independent systematic review of the animal evidence, looking for effects on learning, memory, attention, and response. Oftentimes these were using rodent models, using fairly standard neurobehavioral assays like the Morris water maze, in which distance traveled in order to find an escape platform is measured experimentally. And then in the case of the human systematic review, we used a tool to evaluate the systematic review and then look at if there was any new literature that might have informed the decision of the original systematic review that had been published. So again, in this case, we ended up using a robust tool to evaluate risk of bias of the existing review. We used a navigation guide approach for the human systematic review and the OHAT methodologies for the animal review. And just in the case of the phthalates, this protocol was also peer-reviewed. Next slide, please. So you'll hear more details about what we found with both the phthalate and PBDE systematic reviews, but what I want to do is spend a couple of moments just talking a little bit about the global lessons that our committee learned. So first of all, what we found was that the systematic review process provided a very transparent way in which individuals could seek out literature, identify individual studies that would fit within that systematic reviews, PICO statement. You'll hear more about PICO statements, but basically deciding if it should be included or excluded from a certain study based upon endpoints, the exposure, and also the target organism that we're studying. And that the systematic reviews also provided a very good framework by which you could evaluate individual studies, which you could conduct risk of bias evaluation. One of the real dilemmas that our committee ran into, however, was that we found, especially in the case of the animal studies, oftentimes the published animal studies were silent on certain endpoints that were really important with respect to the risk of bias evaluation. The authors oftentimes would not actually identify whether or not, for example, randomization occurred, or they wouldn't talk about blinding of technical staff to endpoints. And so what we found was that we were consistently or very commonly downgrading certain studies with respect to risk of bias, especially for the animal studies. So one of the global lessons was we all need, as a scientific community, to do a better job of publishing methods so that other individuals know exactly what we're doing in the science. Next slide, please. We also found that meta-analyses were quite valuable in summarizing data from the systematic reviews. Weihsueh will be talking here about meta-analyses of animal data. Meta-analysis of animal data is still an emerging area of interest. It's not an area in which meta-analyses are oftentimes performed. And so more typically, we see meta-analyses in human evidence. I think our committee was pointing to the fact that using systematic reviews and meta-analysis of animal data, it provides a really powerful complement to what we normally do with human epidemiological studies. Next slide, please. The other thing we learned was it was really time and resource intensive. So for any individuals that have not performed systematic reviews, you're extracting a lot of data, you're trying to create different types of tables and putting a lot of data together, and then secondary analyses like meta-analyses and others. And what we found was that because it's time and resource intensive, the EPA and other organizations will have to look for ways that they might have to streamline the process. So for example, in our case, one of the ways we thought that streamlining could occur is if a relevant systematic review, high quality review is already available, that the EPA could develop policies and procedures that would allow them to use contemporary systematic reviews. And again, as I said, not having to start the process all from the very, very, very beginning. Next slide, please. So some other things that we found was that the systematic review for us was endpoint driven with respect to health outcomes. So for example, anogenital distance, or with respect to whether or not phthalates cause changes in hypospadia incidence in animals or in children. But in order to be able to compare dose response information that was being obtained from animal studies, oftentimes fairly short studies, single chemical exposures, relatively high dose exposures, to human epidemiological studies in which mixtures of exposures are occurring to more than one phthalate, more than one PBDE, much lower exposure concentrations occurring in the human epi studies. In order to bridge that analysis, you also have to identify other data streams that you might need. Those data streams could include mechanistic information. It could also include pharmacokinetic information. So as one's doing the systematic review and the data integration, you also have to think about what ancillary data streams might you also need to evaluate in order to look to see whether the human and animal data is concordant or not concordant. Next slide, please. So surprisingly, I think in some ways for our committee, we looked at mechanistic data early on, especially in the case of the phthalates, in order to identify endpoints that we thought could be coupled to testosterone, changes in testosterone within the testes of an exposed male offspring. After those mechanistic studies were looked at and endpoints identified, it actually was a little bit maybe surprising to some of our committee members that the mechanistic data played a more secondary role within the data integration process. So you have to understand that the systematic review process doesn't necessarily have to rely on mechanistic data. That you could make inferences about causality absent strong mechanistic information, and that's not uncommon in the human clinical literature. So what we found was that although adverse outcome pathways and high throughput data and other types of mechanistic data are clearly going to be developed more and more frequently, as we look at the new TSCA rules, there's going to be increasing reliance on high throughput data, but that what we found, at least in this particular group of chemicals, these specific health outcomes, the adverse outcome pathways and high throughput data played a secondary role within the committee's evaluation. Next slide. So I think I'm done in my 10 or 15 minutes, and I'll be joining the group later on if there's questions at the end of the seminar. But Dr. Coleman, I'll toss it back to you to introduce Weihsueh.
Great, thank you so much. We are going to hold questions, as Dr. Dorman said, until the end. I'd like to introduce Dr. Weihsueh Chiu, a professor in the Department of Veterinary Integrative Biosciences at Texas A&M University, College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. He's a research fellow at the Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. He received a bachelor's degree in physics from Harvard University and earned his PhD in physics from Princeton, as well as a certificate in science, technology, and environmental policy from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He spent the first 16 years of his career in government service, first at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and then at the U.S. EPA. And throughout his career, he has been involved in a diverse span of risk assessment topics at the interface between science and policy. So welcome.
All right, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you great.
Okay, great. So I'm going to drill down a little bit onto what we did for phthalates. And as David mentioned, we focused on these effects on male reproductive effects, specifically anogenital distance, fetal testosterone, and hypospadias, because they were sort of mechanistically connected and that was part of our scoping process. We did both human and experimental animal evidence and used the OHAT handbook as sort of the template for conducting these systematic reviews. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is actually on the meta-analysis and how we use that to specifically inform two things. First, the confidence in the body of evidence from the systematic review, and then a little bit more quantitatively related to the dose-response relationships. And although we did many different phthalates, as well as all three endpoints shown here, I'm going to really focus just on DEHP and anogenital distance to provide an illustration. And since that sort of illustrates the main methodological points and challenges. So if you go to the next slide. So, for each body of evidence, we went through this process that is outlined in the OHAT approach. And various different tools were also used as part of our review. So for literature search and screening, we really used Distiller as sort of a very industry standard tool for doing that step in the systematic review. For data extraction and risk of bias, we used the HAWK, the Health Assessment Workspace Collaborative, which is an online web-based content management system that was actually originally developed through a master's student at UNC who's now at the National Toxicology Program, Andy Shapiro, and his advisor, Yvonne Rusin. And it was actually developed as part of a work with EPA when Dr. Rusin was an ORISE fellow for part of his time at EPA. And then for the analysis of the data after we extracted it, we used the R metaphor package to do the meta-analysis. And then the confidence rating and conclusions was really, a committee exercise. And so I'm going to focus more on the last two steps because those involve some sort of new kind of approaches and methodologies in terms of integrating meta-analysis into this sort of overall systematic review process. Next slide, please. So the OHAD approach to evaluating confidence starts with really just the basics of the study design. And for instance, for randomized controlled trials, they start out as having high confidence just because they're inherently designed to address these type of questions. And then other types of study designs start out as either moderate or low or even very low confidence, depending on these various factors that are shown here, whether exposure is controlled, whether you're confident that exposure precedes outcome, et cetera. And then from this initial sort of just based on the study design confidence rating, there's different factors to either decrease or increase the confidence. So decreasing confidence would be problems with risk of bias or internal validity of the various studies, imprecision, whether if the confidence intervals are very large, et cetera. And then various factors that could increase confidence, having a large magnitude of effect, because that's less likely to be due to some third factor or residual confounding, dose-response relationship as well for the same reason. And then that confidence then ends up at, depending on how the different factors either decreased or increased, the confidence in that body of evidence, might change at the end of this rating process. The next slide, please. So we used meta-analysis because it can really directly inform a number of these factors for either decreasing or increasing confidence. Unexplained inconsistency can be explored by looking at whether there's heterogeneity across different studies. Imprecision can be explored by looking at the overall pooled confidence intervals. And then things related to magnitude of effect and dose response also are better informed as an overall body of evidence, looking at using, for instance, meta-regression approaches, and also looking at the overall sort of summary estimate. Next slide. So there are a number of challenges. First, talking about the human data. First, the data were somewhat heterogeneous in terms of how they measured anogenital distance. Anal-scrotal, anal-penile, or an index that was adjusted in some way for body weight. There's also different various measures of exposure that were used, whether it's metabolites, a single metabolite or sum of metabolites, different time periods at which those metabolites were measured, and then some additional reporting elements that, as David mentioned, many times certain things that you would like to have aren't necessarily reported in the study. So for DEHP, we ended up with 6 studies that were sort of met the PICO statement in terms of inclusion, and then 5 of those could be included in meta-analysis. The one that was dropped was because it used the anogenital distance that we couldn't, that wasn't comparable, and anogenital distance index, which wasn't comparable to the other measures. So our overall confidence was sort of moderate, and this is supported by the meta-analysis, which I'll go into in the next slide. So you can see the 5 studies at the top of this forest plot here. As you notice, 2 of them are statistically significant individually, and 3 of them are not. But if you pool the estimate, then you actually get a statistically significant result with no heterogeneity, in that they're all consistent with just random errors. And then as well, we did a sort of sensitivity analysis where we left one study out at a time, and no one study was driving this effect, and they all had statistically significant summary estimates, even dropping each one individually. So because of this statistically significant standardized beta coefficient, we did not downgrade for imprecision. If those confidence intervals had overlapped with no change, then that could have been a reason for downgrading. In addition, all the studies were very consistent in terms of their effect sizes, and so we didn't downgrade for unexplained heterogeneity. Now, this is a relatively small change, so there's only a 4% decrease in anogenital distance for every 10-fold increase in exposure. And so we didn't feel like that was such a large increase that we could upgrade for a large magnitude of effect. And then, these were all supported by the fact that we did numerous sensitivity analysis in addition to the one shown here that showed that the results were robust. The animal studies we also did meta-analysis on, and this presented a number of additional challenges. So this is not as common as a meta-analysis for human studies, although there is sort of a growing body of literature on it in the last few years. So there were multiple species and strains, different dose groups in each study. Studies use different, some of them, they didn't all use the same dose. And the dose measures, some of them had multiple doses, some of them had single doses over a range of values. Again, there's multiple measures of anogenital distance. And, like with the human data where we weren't exactly, the measures of exposure were varied across the studies. Here, although we knew exposure in each study, they were administered during different windows in many cases. And then the outcomes were actually measured at different ages, whereas with the human study, and that was true with the human studies as well, different ages and different baseline values. So in the end, there were 19 studies that sort of met the inclusion criteria, 16 of which were included in a meta-analysis. Now, because these were experimental studies, they started out with a high confidence rating already, and then we had no reasons to downgrade the confidence, so it ended up as well at a high level of confidence. And so I'll show in the next few slides what we did in terms of the meta-analysis, but also note that we did meta-regression to try to get a sort of a summary benchmark dose estimate, so to be more in line with how sort of the risk assessment process. So we go to the next slide. So we did sort of a number of different approaches for the meta-analysis. One is just to have just treated and controls regardless of the treatment dose, looking at whether there is just an overall summary effect. We looked at heterogeneity as with the human studies using random effects models, and then because we knew that there was a priori that it was reasonable to expect species and strain differences, we did subgrouping by strain and species to look at whether those explain some of the heterogeneity. And then we also looked at the effects of dose using some meta-regression models. So next slide. So these results are too small because there's so many studies, and each study had multiple dose groups and sometimes multiple animal groups. But you can just sort of eyeballing it, you can see that actually many studies didn't have a statistically significant pairwise effect for anogenital distance. But if you combine them all together with the diamonds there, you generally get a statistically significant decrease in anogenital distance. Now you can also sort of just eyeballing see that there is a fair amount of heterogeneity. Here, this I-squared statistic is 46%. But a lot of this is explained by subgrouping. For instance, the largest group of data was from Sprague-Dawley rats. That's sort of that group in the middle, and there was no heterogeneity actually across all those rats. And then for the Wistar rats and the Long-Evans rats, you can actually see these are arranged in order of dose. So there's a general trend with increasing dose as you go down the graph for that top and the bottom groups. And so we would expect that those high levels of heterogeneity are probably explained just by having different dose levels. So that leads to the next slide. That leads to the next slide here where we're doing the meta-regression. And when we do that, you can see there's sort of a gray band amongst the error bars that shows the meta-regression results. And particularly when we, the heterogeneity goes down a significant amount when we apply this, the meta-regression that accounts for dose, and this was as expected. So within each subgroup, there's a log linear trend, although it's only statistically significant in the Wistar rats. And then the trend with dose as opposed to log dose is significant in all the strains. And again, the heterogeneity, although the long Evans rats, there's still high heterogeneity, but that's only, only a few data points, and that's really just a dose response fitting issue. But the other ones, the heterogeneity was reduced to, a very low level, accounting for dose. The next slide. So seeing how these then interplay with overall confidence in the body of evidence. So the first is that, there's certainly no downgrade for imprecision. Even though a lot of studies didn't have statistically significant pairwise comparisons, the overall body certainly is strong in terms of showing an overall effect on AGD. And so we didn't downgrade for imprecision. And the second, in terms of unexplained inconsistency, because the heterogeneity was largely explained by after we subgroup by strain and species and then do meta-regression by dose, we didn't downgrade there either due to, for unexplained inconsistency. Now, there was a fairly large effect size in a number of these studies, as you can, could see from the forest plots towards the bottom. We're getting to many, 10 to 20% changes in AGD, and so we did feel that there was justification to upgrade for a large magnitude of effect, as well as for the dose response trends that we saw in the meta-regression. Now, of course, all of these were already, because we didn't downgrade for anything, it was already at high confidence. So the further upgrades didn't actually, you can't go to super high or very high. You just, stay at high. But just, it's more to illustrate the principle of how you can use meta-analysis results to inform these factors. The next slide. So the other advantage of doing the meta-regression is that we can actually characterize dose response, the points of departure for risk assessment in a way that doesn't, that can pool across studies. So here you can see for DHP, all strains together, there's the benchmark dose value. This is for a 5% change. It's about 270. And then the individual strains, there's a little bit of variation with some strains being a little bit more sensitive than others. But the red lines there are sort of for the overall effect across studies, whereas the blue lines illustrate when there's heterogeneity, how that might vary across studies. So we actually tried doing the benchmark dose on each individual study and then pulling those, but that actually didn't work nearly as well. There's a lot of failure in the benchmark dose modeling, particularly for studies that didn't have a lot of dose groups. So in the end here, for the evidence integration, we use this matrix from the OHAD approach, where you have animal studies on the x-axis and then human studies on the y-axis. And because the animal evidence is high and then the human evidence is moderate, we end up where that blue circle is, that it would be presumed to, the DHP would be presumed to affect male reproductive development in this particular manner. And then the mechanistic considerations, there's definitely biological plausibility. As David mentioned, that was sort of built in because of how we did the planning and scoping for this analysis. And then, there does seem to be, mechanistically well-conserved sort of mechanisms across and developmental stages across species. On the next slide. So another part of our chart was to look at sort of low, the low dose issue. And so, because we had the dose data, exposure data for both the human and the animals, we could actually do, some comparisons across the human and animal studies. Now, if we just compare on intakes alone, the intakes of DHP in the human studies, epidemiologic studies, is many orders of magnitude lower than those that show effects in the animal studies. So, there's definitely a discordance there, several thousand-fold. The interesting thing is that as you got to more and more internal dose measures, there seemed to be a smaller magnitude of difference. So if we compared urine between animals and humans, and then amniotic fluid between animals and humans, there actually became, 100-fold for urine, and then, maybe 10-fold or a little bit less for amniotic fluid, although the data gets sparser and sparser as you get to more internal dose measures. So, the basic, the main robust conclusion is that for hazard identification, it seems like the testing in rodents, is working pretty well. You're ending up with the same endpoint that you see in the human studies, and you can detect those in the animal studies. But the prediction of actual exposure levels seems to be discordant, and some of the toxicokinetics might actually be part of this, related, and that the evidence for that being that the internal exposures seem to be closer than the external one. But this is, remains to be further investigated. The next slide is just sort of a table comparing these different dose metrics and how that margin of exposure seems to, between the animal and the human estimate at which effects appear to be occurring, that margin seems to get smaller as you get to internal measures of dose. So the final slide is really just some lessons learned from this systematic review. The first is that meta-analysis and meta-regression can be very valuable in looking across the body of evidence in a quantitative manner, both directly informing that sort of confidence rating, whether we upgrade or downgrade the rating for the various factors of related to robustness of the body of evidence, as well as for characterizing the dose-response relationships, so that more on the dose-response side for risk assessment. And then finally, when we have both human and animal evidence, it provides a basis for sort of comparing and integrating those data across species. Now, a lot of the challenges that we face are actually fairly common across more than just phthalates. There's for the animal studies, there's generally multiple dose groups, and the way traditional meta-analyses are designed is that it's really effect sizes for each dose group. So they're all compared to single control. So there's some correlation there that could be addressed using sort of more sophisticated models. There is a number of endpoints for which there's zero background incidence in the animal studies, and like the hypospadias. And so we actually couldn't do the meta-analysis for hypospadias because of the zero background incidence. All the methods for meta-analysis are really, from, there's been a lot more development in the human literature for which, the zero background incidence is never really a problem. But again, needing some methodological development to deal with that. Third, for dose response, we only applied some fairly simple linear and linear quadratic models in meta-regression because that was what sort of the standard software could accommodate. Whereas, for benchmark dose modeling, for risk assessment, we generally have more, a larger suite of models, but they haven't been implemented in a way that sort of in an easy-to-use package for doing meta-regression. The fourth is related to experimental designs and complex endpoints. That's really an issue, for instance, for the PBDEs, which will be discussed in a moment. So I'll leave that point for Andy to discuss. And then, as Dave mentioned, incomplete reporting is really a problem, particularly for animal studies, that sort of hinders the ability to do these type of meta-analysis and meta-regression. With that, I'll turn it back to Trish and on to Dr. Lam.
Great, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I think we're going to do some quick check on muting some of the lines.
I'm just going to mute the audio, and then when they...
Okay, and then we'll come back to that.
Yeah,
wonderful.
exactly.
Great. Thank you, Andy. So next I'd like to introduce Dr. Juleen Lam. She is an associate research scientist at the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment, Department of OBGYN and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. She leads the Navigation Guide Working Group and has been involved in systematic review methodology since 2011. She's authored 4 case studies in applying the Navigation Guide methodology to environmental health policy relevant situations. She's currently leading a 6-case study to address the association between formaldehyde exposure and asthma health outcomes. Prior to coming to UCSF, she completed 2 postdocs at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and at Johns Hopkins University. She earned several master's degrees, including a BS in mathematics and environmental toxicology at UC Davis, an MS at George Washington University, master's in biostatistics, and a PhD at Johns Hopkins University. She's recently joined the U.S. EPA's Board of Scientific Counselors as well. So welcome, Dr. Lam.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for this opportunity to come here and speak with you all today. I want to thank the organizers and Dr. Coleman in particular for putting together such a fantastic panel. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about a systematic review that we had completed. So my time here talking to you, it was great to have Drs. Dorman and Chiu give an introductory to both the NAS report as well as one case example of a systematic review. And I hope after seeing Drs. Chiu example walking you through the inception of the study question all the way to the end, you can kind of gain an appreciation for just how challenging systematic reviews can be. This is something that I've worked with for quite some time now at my role at the University of California, San Francisco. And what I'm going to do first is kind of take a step backwards. So first, before I delve into the second case study, which is going to be equally as technically complex and challenging as the first one you saw, I want to first take a step back as kind of an outsider to this NAS report. So we weren't involved in the committee. Ultimately, our systematic review for PBDEs and IQ was utilized in the report, but we're coming from more of an academic perspective where we started to get involved in systematic review and interested in these methods in about 2009. And first, I'm going to kind of set the stage for how we got involved in systematic review, why it was so important for understanding what kind of tools we can use for taking the science and integrating it into making decisions, and then talk a little bit about the PBDE case study. This one is done in humans, so it's a little bit different from the one you just heard about from Dr. Chiu. So in some ways a little bit simpler because it's in humans, but in other ways a lot more challenging because it deals with epidemiological studies, which inherently have their own issues embedded in study designs and implementation. And then touch on the National Academy of Sciences application, where then I'll turn it over to Dr. Rooney, who will be talking a little bit more specifically about how our case study and other bodies of evidence were used for this application to the NAS. So first, just to give a little bit of background for kind of where I come from. So I'm on from the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment. So there, our mission is to create a healthier environment for human reproduction and development. So we really focus on a sensitive time period, a susceptible time period of human reproduction and development. So during pregnancy or early childhood development, where a lot of times the chemicals that you might be exposed to during pregnancy or during childhood development can have very serious and long-term implications for chronic health conditions or even acute health conditions. And so we kind of focus on this in our work at the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment. And we focus in a few different ways. So first, we're in a school of medicine, not a school of public health. So it's a kind of a little bit of a different lens or perspective where a lot of times we're working with clinicians who interact one-on-one with patients and may be able to make recommendations for patients during pregnancy or as they're bringing in their child for early checkups, where they might have this opportunity to intervene and to provide information about chemical exposures, environmental exposures that they might be concerned about, and certain individual behavior changes that you can make to reduce exposures to chemicals. So we do a lot of work on that side of things. but also the burden shouldn't necessarily be all on the individual. So a lot of our work focuses at the policy level too, and also of course generating original research where we start to indicate what chemicals might be of concern, and then start to work with policymakers in making them aware of this is what the science is saying, and this is where potentially we can take action and help to reduce exposures to the population on a wide-scale basis. So this is where we focus on. And in particular, in environmental health, it's been quite challenging for us because we've been long accustomed to kind of having what we call narrative expert-based reviews, where authors basically go in the literature, they identify a pile of papers that are relevant to a study question, and they usually come to a conclusion that looks something like this, which basically sums up to, we find some studies that show positive associations, we find some studies that may show negative associations, some that show null associations, and really more research is needed because it's really unclear what the picture is overall about the potential for toxicity for this particular chemical and particular health effect. So oftentimes we see these types of reviews being published, and especially when you're working in the policy arena and you're trying to tell a policymaker or decision maker, you know, these are things we should be concerned about. When they go in the literature and see these types of reviews, that's really where it gets really confusing for them. They don't really understand what the science says and what that means in terms of their decision making. And in particular, I think Dr. Dorman talked about this a little bit in terms of being able to understand a review and understand all of the different components that went into it, where you might use these things to either evaluate the quality of a review or try to reproduce the review if you wanted to kind of do an independent third party, make sure that it's something that could be reproduced if you tried to reassess the chemical in the same way. But a big problem is a lot of these times these narrative-based reviews lack even the basic information that you would need in order to evaluate its quality. So things like whether it provides all the search terms. How did those authors go into the scientific literature? What databases did they use? What types of search terms did they use? What were the inclusion-exclusion criteria for deciding when a study is included and it's relevant versus when it's not included and it's not relevant? A lot of times this information just isn't reported in these types of narrative-based reviews. And so here I show kind of a myriad of a dozen or so different reviews that have been published on the same topic, and you can see just how many pieces of information they're lacking. So this can also raise challenges too, because when you find a narrative-based review, first, the conclusion isn't always apparent, and then second, you don't even really know how they did that review, how they implemented their search, and how they came to those final conclusions. So this was really the impetus for how we started to develop these types of systematic review methods in environmental health. And so one of the things that we did was we learned from other fields that have faced this very same problem. So decades ago in the clinical sciences, so in the medical literature, this is something that they were facing a few decades ago, exact same problem. When you had new medical interventions or new medical treatments that were coming out, how did they decide if that medical treatment was better than what they already had, so what they were already recommending to their patients? So this is something that was developed by the Cochrane collaboration. This is a global independent network, which essentially is a collection of experts from the medical field in all countries around the world, where they got together and decided, okay, this is how we're going to develop a framework for what they call evidence-based medicine. So what's a framework for how we decide what studies to look at, how to integrate the evidence, and then how to come to final conclusions about whether to recommend a new intervention or a new pharmaceutical drug or a new treatment to address a disease. So this has been done in the medical sciences, but unfortunately we can't just take what's been done in the medical sciences and implement it directly for environmental health. And that's because of a couple different reasons, actually a few reasons, but I'm going to talk about only the two main ones here. So first, in evidence-based medicine, in the medical sciences, they have access to and routinely utilize what are called randomized controlled trials. So they have the ability, if you have a new pharmaceutical drug, and they're actually required, mandated to do this federally, to have a trial where they take a collection of individuals who volunteer to be in the study. They randomize them into different groups where sometimes people will get a placebo, one group will get the new drug, sometimes there'll be another group with the old drug. And because you randomize them, you kind of minimize biases that might exist in differences between the study participants. And you do that, and then you're able to randomize the treatments and see how does the new treatment perform over the placebo, and how does it perform over the old treatment. Now, obviously in environmental health sciences, we typically don't have that type of evidence. So we can't randomize people and give them exposures to a chemical and then have people not exposed and then compare what the outcomes are, right? So oftentimes we don't have these kinds of randomized control trials. So instead we have human observational studies, so epidemiological studies, and then also sometimes we have experimental animal studies or experimental in vitro studies where they're done in cells. So that's different, right? We have a different evidence base that we're evaluating. Also, the ultimate goal is a little bit different. So in evidence-based medicine, oftentimes you're introducing something where you're wanting it to treat a disease and minimize any potential introduction of harm. So you want to make sure that it's effective treatment, but it's not introducing any sort of side effects or any other harm that isn't already existing in the current treatment. This is a little bit different for environmental health sciences, right? Because oftentimes the chemical exposures are already occurring. So what we want to do is reduce the existing harms. So that kind of creates a different priority in terms of how you evaluate the evidence and come to your conclusions. So this is the approach that we decided to take. So basically what we did was, it was a collaborative effort. So we had about over 20 different scientists from academia, from government, from nonprofit organizations that got together and said, okay, how can we take this Cochrane approach designed for the medical sciences and then tailor it so that it can be useful for an environmental health approach? And our goal was ultimately to establish a systematic and a transparent method for bridging this gap between how the science is evaluated in the clinical sciences versus environmental health sciences. And this is the framework that I'm going to show here and then not really talk about, because I'm going to go through these steps in the case study. And this is kind of a different approach than you just saw from Drs. Dorman and Chiu. This is what we call the navigation guide, but it's actually very similar to the OHAD approach that they had already discussed in the last two. You'll notice some of the similarities in terms of looking at strength of evidence in human systems, kind of the overall approach of specifying a study question and selecting the evidence. A lot of those same steps are exactly the same between these two approaches. But this is the approach that we developed and we were using. And again, I won't talk about the framework too much because the case study will go through each step, but just to say that our overall priorities were for it to be a systematic and transparent and reproducible search. So again, a lot of those narrative-based reviews just aren't reproducible because a lot of information is missing. This approach is intended so that if someone is looking at our publication, they're able to go in and search the literature, use the same inclusion-exclusion criteria, use the same criteria for evaluating the evidence, and ideally come to a similar conclusion, or at the very least, be able to see where the expert judgment differed and why that resulted in a different conclusion. So it's really a framework for how these streams of evidence are to be integrated. And you heard about this from Dr. Dorman, so I won't spend too much time on this, in that the National Academy of Sciences has paid a lot of attention to this particular topic for some time now. So it's come up in a few different reports recommending systematic review be used in evaluating chemical assessments. So I'm going to jump into the case study. What we have here is just kind of a timeline of how much work we've been doing in systematic review since 2009. So our framework was published in 2011, and since then we've undertaken 6 different case studies, 5 of which have been published and 1 which is currently in progress. And today I'm going to talk mostly about the PBDE and neurodevelopmental case study, which was ultimately used in the NAS report. So first, to just give a little bit of background for those of you who might not be familiar, PBDEs stands for polybrominated diphenyl ethers. This is a group, so it's a class of a variety of different chemicals that are all man-made, and they've been in use for several decades now at this point. Some of these have been banned or voluntarily phased out by the company or the manufacturer, but they're still present because a lot of older products, such as couches and electronics that used to contain PBDEs, obviously still contain PBDEs. So just because it's banned doesn't mean it disappears from all products, right? If you have an older couch that's laying around your home, it likely contains PBDEs. So a lot of these exposures persist, even though the chemical itself is starting to slowly be phased out of production. PBDEs generally has been associated with fertility and reproductive health effects, and the outcome that we were focusing on in this case study is neurodevelopmental toxicity. So we were looking at this study question of whether developmental exposures to PBDEs is associated with intelligence, so measures such as IQ, intelligence quotient, And as a secondary outcome, we looked at attention-related behavioral conditions, so things like ADHD. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus today on the intelligence outcome, so I'll only talk about that. Dr. Dorman alluded to this earlier, a PICO statement. And so this is a way to list out different considerations that specify exactly what your study question is going to focus on. So our study question was this, kind of very broadly, developmental exposures and IQ, but we need to know specifically what types of evidence are going to be considered relevant to that study question. So we outlined certain characteristics about the study population, how the exposure and the outcome are defined, and as well as the comparator group. So that's the acronym for PICO. So we, in our case study, only looked at the human evidence. So we're looking at human epidemiological evidence. We were looking at any exposures that occur during development, so during pregnancy or early childhood, looking at exposures to PBDEs that occur prior to the assessment of the outcome of intelligence. For PBDEs, as I mentioned, exposure is ubiquitous in the population. And so for human epidemiological studies, it's very rare that you're able to look at people who are exposed and people who are not exposed. Usually in the population, there's going to be some even baseline level of exposure. So usually you compare humans that are exposed to higher versus lower levels and look at how those differ for every increment increase in exposures. So this is the process by which we undertook the systematic review. So first, the first step that we usually take is developing what's called a protocol. So the protocol is something where you outline basically every single step that you propose in your systematic review, from how you define your PICO statement and what your study question is, to how you're proposing doing the systematic search, to how you select the relevant bodies of evidence, how you rate the evidence, and how you rate the ultimate quality and strength of the evidence. So these are kind of the steps that you already saw Dr. Chiu walk through. And as we were planning on doing the same thing, we developed a protocol that outlined exactly how each step would be taken. And the idea is to minimize biases that might occur as you're evaluating the evidence as a reviewer. So you're basically telling people this is what we propose to do, and then also gives people kind of a landmark to say, okay, when you publish that ultimate paper, did you stick to everything that you said you were going to do in the protocol? And if there's any deviation, why did that happen? And one way to kind of hold yourself accountable to that is not only having the protocol, but pre-publishing it. So oftentimes what we do is we use a database which is called Prospero. It's a database that's searchable and publicly available, and you can put these protocols up and register them so that, again, somebody can look at your publication and then go back to look at your protocol and see whether or not you made any modifications and whether you justified those modifications. So it's a little kind of a way to hold yourself accountable as an investigator. But then also another kind of side effect of that is it also avoids any wasted research resources. So somebody who's interested in a similar topic and might want to do a systematic review on PBDEs and IQ, they would have been able to go and search this website and say, oh, these investigators are already doing something, so maybe I'll focus on a slightly different exposure, slightly different outcome. And that kind of avoids, being scooped, or maybe you're actually setting yourself up to be scooped because you're telling people what you're doing. But it's just another way of kind of transferring information so that people understand what's going on in the field. So now I'm going to talk about the various steps of our systematic review. So the first step is identifying the literature. So you have to go into the body of literature. We search both scientific journals, databases like PubMed and Web of Science, but also things like Google Scholar and kind of what's called the gray literature, so things that are not necessarily peer-reviewed, government reports, master's thesis, PhD thesis, conference abstracts. We really try to identify all the possible literature that's available. We usually do this with a librarian just because this is really a separate field, and it's pretty easy to take a few search terms and search PubMed. But if you really want to craft a search strategy that's broad enough to capture everything, but narrow enough to eliminate as much junk as possible, it really takes a trained information specialist to be able to develop these types of search strategies. So we take full advantage of that. We use a Cochrane-trained librarian. We also do things like hand-searching reference lists of review papers that we know are relevant. So we really try to capture all the relevant papers that we can find. We have exclusion criteria, which is, again, outlined in our protocol and is really crafted by the PICO statement in our study question. So things like if it didn't involve human subjects. Since we're interested primarily in human studies, those are the studies are going to be excluded. This is kind of the process of what a typical systematic review looks like. So usually it looks quite daunting where you have 5,000 studies or so, but once you go through and exclude out non-relevant studies, you oftentimes find, ideally, if your study question is quite narrow like ours, kind of a manageable number of studies. So out of these 2,500 studies that we ultimately screened, we found 10 studies that were relevant to IQ. So now I'm already running out of time and I haven't even talked about the review process itself, but I already knew that I wouldn't have a lot of time to talk about these different steps, but I wanted to show you kind of the framework for how we do this. And Dr. Chiu actually set this up quite nicely because you'll notice a lot of these criteria are kind of similar things to what was presented by Dr. Dorman and Dr. Chiu, things that we would evaluate a study for. So things like risk of bias, where you're looking at each individual study and seeing whether there are any limitations that you might be concerned about in how the study was designed or how it was conducted. And then also looking at things that Dr. Chiu just talked about, things like indirectness, inconsistency, imprecision. Publication bias is a huge one. So those of us in academia know that publication bias is always a concern. Things where studies that find null or negative results might not be as publishable, and so you might not be able to find those studies in the literature. So that's something that we evaluate as well. And then all of those things feed into the strength of the evidence, where, again, you kind of saw this from Dr. Chiu as well, evaluating the confidence of the effect, the direction of the effect, and coming to our final conclusions, which are at the bottom here, which these are our final ratings, which are kind of similar to the approach that OHAT takes. So really quickly looking through our results. So risk of bias I talked about, this is evaluating each study for any limitations that you might see. So in human epi studies, the green is pretty good and the red is potentially some limitations. Overall for the epi studies, you see a lot of green. So most of these studies are well conducted, they're high quality, there's very minimal things that you'd be concerned about in terms of potential biases. But you do have some studies where, for instance, you see kind of this line of pink here, which means for confounding, there might be some important confounders that the study didn't adjust for, and that's always a concern in epidemiological studies. So that's kind of typical for what we see. Overall, the epi studies tend to perform quite well, but there are certain characteristics that are limiting. This is our meta-analysis. So similar to what Dr. Chiu had, we did a meta-analysis for the human evidence. We had 4 studies that we could combine, which represented 8,000 mother-child pairs, 8,000 mother-child pairs across 8 different countries, I think, across these 4 studies. And similar to what Dr. Chiu was showing, you have, if you just looked at these 4 studies by themselves or even collectively on this forest plot, you see that generally they're showing a negative association. So what I mean by that is increased PBDE exposure leads to reductions in IQ. But some of them are not statistically significant. Some of them have quite wide confidence intervals. But you see that when you combine them in a meta-analysis, you come to a conclusion where you see this very tight confidence interval. So you're increasing the precision by pooling together all of this information into one final estimate. So here we see a reduction of 3.7 decrements in IQ points with every 10-fold increase in PBDE exposures. And the meta-analysis, although it's one part of the quantitative analysis, you saw that we only had 4 studies in the meta-analysis, but we had 10 different studies overall, right? So we don't just look at the meta-analysis. Sometimes we'll look at quantitative estimates from the other studies and compare them either on a figure, on a table, to see what other information can be contributed from other studies, even though they might not necessarily be able to be combined in a meta-analysis for various reasons. So we do evaluate kind of all of the evidence. This is a similar table to what you saw from Dr. Chiu evaluating the animal evidence, but here we're evaluating the human evidence. The human evidence, we're starting out as moderate, and when we're looking across all of the different domains, the only thing that we really felt warranted a potential upgrade was dose response assessment, where we saw several studies with increasing exposures to PBDE exposures. You see a very nice relationship with decrements in IQ with increasing exposures. But that dose response, although it did warrant an upgrade, didn't necessarily change our final rating, and so we did end up with a moderate rating. So that moderate rating fed into the quality of evidence, where we also looked at a few other factors, and ultimately we came to a conclusion of sufficient evidence of toxicity. And so that was our final conclusion, sufficient evidence of toxicity. And that's kind of the summation of our results, but obviously it's a lot of information to sum up into one statement saying, okay, there's sufficient evidence of toxicity. So we do have kind of a definition in our protocol for exactly what constitutes sufficient and what that actually means. So we have more details surrounding that, but it is a very simple bottom line statement of a conclusion. Where in contrast, if you compare that to the narrative reviews where they kind of waffled and not really coming to a conclusion, this is a more simple bottom line statement that's potentially actionable. So this is going to segue into the NAS report. I will say that we did have kind of fortuitous timing because right at that time, San Francisco was proposing banning flame retardants in all products. And that bill actually did pass, but it came out around the same time. The bill was proposed around the same time that we published our study. And so we were able to kind of use our study and get some media attention and then also testify in front of the Board of Supervisors to support the inaction of this bill. So that was a really great way that our findings kind of integrated with policy. And then now Dr. Dorman's already kind of given away a lot of the recommendations and kind of what the report said. But in particular, one part of the report, as Dr. Dorman mentioned, was taking an existing systematic review and using it to update the evidence for instance, a chemical agency wanting to do a chemical assessment. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rooney to talk about that. But one last thing that I just wanted to highlight before I go is that our group does a lot of policy work. And so we do have a briefing on the Toxic Substances Control Act that we're doing in Washington, D.C. on the Hill, and that's going to be on April 12th. We do have a time now, it's 11 a.m. Eastern time, and this is going to be webcast. So for any of you interested in this kind of science to policy translation, we have a really fantastic panel, which includes Dr. David Michaels from George Washington University, Eve Gartner from Earth Justice, Monique Hardin, who's from the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, who works a lot with the community. So it's a mix of academics and other folks who are going to be talking about toxic substance control in the United States. So if you're interested, please register for this event, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Rooney. Or to Dr.
Yeah, so my job is to introduce our final speaker. So Dr. Andrew Rooney is the Acting Director of the Office of Health Assessment and Translation in the National Toxicology Program at NIEHS. He has many years of experience in toxicology and risk assessment for the protection of public health, resulting in contributions to both peer-reviewed literature and government assessments, such as National Toxicology Program monographs, EPA IRIS toxicology reviews, and World Health Organization guidelines. Dr. Rooney has been collaborating on methods to characterize study quality in terms of risk of bias for human, animal, and mechanistic studies, and adaptation of systematic review methods into environmental health questions. He has a master's degree and PhD in zoology from the University of Florida. So welcome, Dr. Rooney.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I would also like to thank the organizers, Dr. Coleman, for the invitation, and also for the structure of this. If you're following the different presentations, we're starting with the NAS report, and certainly the chair of the NAS committee, Dr. Dorman, but then we take a break and we go over to California for the navigation guide with the PBDE evaluation because of the goals of that NAS committee. And so what I would like to highlight is in my view, what I'm hearing from Dr. Dorman is really how the NAS committee and the NAS report was developed, the goals for providing guidance on low dose and the use of systematic review methods to EPA, as well as the history of those reports, also highlighted by Dr. Lam. And then Dr. Chiu provided more information on systematic review methods, including the phthalate case study, and the utility of meta-analysis within the process, and how truly valuable that was for reaching conclusions and adding to our confidence. As well as in his case study, the PBDE, or the phthalate case study, what I like to highlight is it's a very well-established mechanism. And despite how well-established the mechanism and what could concentrate with that evaluation, the mechanistic data didn't really change the conclusions. And then with Dr. Lam's presentation, we saw more of the context about systematic review and the details. In some cases, for those of us that are practitioners of systematic review, it sounds like I'm a witch or something, right? I'm a practitioner. of systematic review. It's excruciating detail because it does take an awful lot of time and effort to do this, but really to emphasize the importance of that and the transparency. And again, how systematic review was developed for the human PBD. Now, and then in context and reality, Dr. Dorman laid out that we knew this systematic review was being developed and almost published, so we could show EPA, if we could do it successfully, how an off-the-shelf systematic review could be considered. And so here I'm coming in at the end to talk again about the methods, but then the consideration of the published systematic review as well as an update. Okay, you don't need the title. The disclaimer here, these are my findings and conclusions in case I screw anything up, and I certainly am not speaking on behalf of the National Toxicology Program, but I think that it is a important basis to say that the methods between the OHAT method and the navigation guide are several examples of systematic review methods applied to environmental health questions, and they're consistent. There's some differences, but they're overall consistent. What do systematic review methods do? They don't completely replace risk assessment methods or the type of narrative reviews, but they step up the game. They increase the transparency, the objectivity, and the rigor. We didn't just build this from scratch. We took it and we built on the well-established methods from the past. As Dr. Lam was saying, the Cochrane collaboration and the GRADE and the AHRQ evidence-based practice centers, as well as the work from Camarades and the Flory group that have moved it to preclinical studies, all of these looking at interventions. But then we modified that along with the navigation guide to adapt systematic review to environmental health questions. So now we're considering three lines of evidence: the human studies, the animal studies, and then mechanistic evidence that could come from a variety of sources. And all of these go through the systematic review process. At the bottom of the slide, highlighted with my little look here, arrow, an additional process to bring them together. Of course, if you have different pieces of evidence, you need a method to synthesize them. And again, to go back to a point made by, I think, all of the speakers, you start with a specific statement of the review question. And so we have this specific statement for the PBDE case study. Is developmental exposure, I'll read it right off the slide, to PBDEs in non-human mammals associated with alterations in learning, memory, attention, or response inhibition? And why did we have that question? Because we had a paired research question to look at the human and animal evidence together, and we knew somebody had done the human systematic review, so we were trying to show how they could be evaluated together. We knew they'd done a really good job. We know their methods. But we wanted to demonstrate to EPA that you could take any off-the-shelf method. It could be produced by industry. And you could critically evaluate it as the applicability to your question and then the methods that they engaged in. Now, applicability, we matched our question to their review, so it was going to be applicable. But it would be an important consideration. We went through our PICO statement, which is a reflection of that study question. What population? We cited non-human mammals. We could have looked at studies of PBDEs in fish and reptiles, and I would have been more interested. But we tried to reduce that to what the regulators were more likely to use, and in the interest of time, finish the evaluation. So there was our exposure. There was our comparator. We wanted exposed to vehicle-only treatment to have the highest quality studies. And then the outcome measures were equivalent because in the rodent models, you can't really test IQ, but there's established models for those endpoints. We had the separate protocols, and I would strongly support what Dr. Lam was saying, that these protocols should be put out in the peer-reviewed literature so people know what you're doing. They can help you, they can criticize you, they can review the protocol, they can stop doing the exact same thing that you're doing to reduce research. But because of the NIS policies, we could have them peer-reviewed, but we couldn't release it where they would know, kind of a look behind the curtain what we were doing, and that wasn't possible. But we would certainly promote that. Finally, for these systematic review. One of the things you do in the transparency is you have this Prisma diagram, preferred reporting diagram to identify not just your specific search string, but then how many studies did you evaluate? Did you identify across those different literatures? There were over 1,800 studies, animal studies identified, and after duplicate removal, they were individually screened using the software that Dr. Chiu mentioned, the distiller software, and we came down to 67 studies that were assessed at the full text stage to verify that they were indeed relevant, and 27 animal studies including the synthesis. And in contrast to what Dr. Lam was saying, some of your research questions, you end up with several hundred studies no matter what you're doing because of the question. And it's an art to ask a question that can be answered in the appropriate time period and provides the information to the policymakers. So that I think that is the critical point that people are going to be struggling with. We have more of a challenge getting there than they seem to. They're much better at it than we are. But with these animal studies, you had data on multiple PBDEs. And Dr. Chiu set this up as one of those things in a challenge in reaching conclusions. You know in toxicology that you have multiple different animal models. We knew by this question we had multiple chemicals. We didn't just ask, is PBDE 47 associated with changes in learning and memory, but we had across these different PBDEs to match with the human situation. So how do you synthesize across chemicals if you have only 1 or 2 studies on one chemical and 5 on another? Are they really inconsistent? Across a range of the test assays, and this neurotox assays in animals drive me crazy because there's slightly different assays performed by every individual lab. It's like you want your own patent on it, so there's a different assay. And so we had a really difficult time synthesizing, and luckily Dr. Dorman's an expert in this area and helped us try to see through that chaff and try to see what the signal was. But there's a range of species, strain, and sex, and just because you had differences, if they were all different species, strain, and sex, is that inconsistent, or is that simply explainable inconsistency? So it's not. It was very difficult to reach conclusions here. But what we did is, looking at PBDE 47, one of the largest bodies of evidence, there were 6 studies of learning in rodents. There was reduced learning in both of the rat studies, and reduced learning in 3 out of the 4 mouse studies in at least 1 sex species or strain or time period. So it was a difficult signal to evaluate, but we had to step back and use our scientific judgment, and we judged this as a consistent body of evidence. The memory was not. We then looked at study quality in terms of risk of bias. We have a different color scheme than the navigation guide, but there's a specific set of internal validity or risk of bias questions. And I like what Juleen was saying. Green means good. Green is a low risk of bias, and then orange or red are the higher risk of bias, the studies that have a problem in study design or conduct. Not every risk of bias question is considered to be as important. Dr. Lam was emphasizing confounding for the human studies. For the animal studies, one of the key factors is the randomization of individual animals across treatments. So any animal had an equal opportunity of being assigned any treatment. You can't take all the big rats and you assign them to the treatment study if you're trying to develop a new treatment. And the scrawny rats, you assign them to the control study if you're trying to, again, evaluate your treatment, or conversely, if you're trying to prove that your chemical is not toxic. So randomization is key, and that's a take-home message if you weren't listening to anything else. Risk of bias for your studies, for people to use those studies, you want to do key risk of bias factors. And I didn't mean to quite go forward. The randomization is key, the blinding of the outcome assessor so they don't know what treatment it is, and then some other factors, in this case, developmental studies, so the control for litter, or the litter is a unit of analysis. You can't take 12 animals from the same litter and then split them up, because the litter should really be, if the treatment was during development, the unit of analysis. And if I didn't explain that well, we can talk later. I'll try again. Then we move on to our approach to considering the confidence ratings or the certainty. Juleen has spoken about this in terms of quality. There's abundance of terminology there, and they're slightly different. Or Dr. Chiu was presenting this on our OHAT handbook. It's a slightly different figure, but you start with your body of evidence, and the confidence or certainty rating is a measure of certainty that the findings from that group of studies reflect the true relationship between exposure to a substance and effect. And it's a grade working group method, and they're constantly refining and changing and willing to consider new methods. It's a fantastic group. They're also meeting in interesting places. I think they're in Colombia in a couple of weeks, so if you get a chance to go. Bodies of evidence from animal studies, they start with the high initial confidence. You consider these factors, I won't go through them, that might increase or decrease your confidence. Was it consistent, dose response, risk of bias problems, and then you have your final confidence ratings. So for our 6 studies of learning in rodents, basically it was consistent evidence. I can't read that. I put on my glasses. Reduced learning in rats and mice, but there were concerns for risk of bias. There was a lot of orange and red. And so the high initial confidence was downgraded to moderate for those animals. And then we moved on to level of evidence, again, similar to Dr. Lam, considering the direction of effect or whether we have effect or not. The moderate confidence went straight across and stayed as a moderate level of evidence. And just note, I talked about PBDE 47, but there was other exposures that were considered. The human studies, I don't have to cover this because you already heard about it. We identified in a literature search, surprise, there was a systematic review by Lam et al. And we used that as our basis, but then we updated it, the literature search, to see if there was additional studies. We did find 3 additional studies, and we needed to consider those as well. How do we then evaluate a published systematic review? There's a great tool out there that starts with a quick question on the applicability to your question. And applicability is just as important as whether or not it was done well, or there's risk of bias in that published review. We rigged the system, we didn't have to deal with this, but if it's not directly applicable, then you wouldn't be able to use, or if it's only partially applicable, you wouldn't be able to use. They have a nice color-coded evaluation of concerns with the review process and judging overall risk of bias of the published review. I can tell you for relevance, yes, it was clearly relevant to our question. There were no concerns across multiple aspects of the review process, and therefore, conclusively, it had low risk of bias, or it was appropriate to use that published systematic review. They rated the confidence or quality in their terms, moderate quality. They used a grade approach. It's slightly different, and so we left their method right there. We took their moderate quality and translated it into the OHAT method with moderate confidence. We didn't go on to sufficient because that wasn't within our methodology, and that's what you would do. You use data as appropriate for your purposes, or this review as appropriate. The level of evidence in the NAS report then took that moderate confidence and translated it to a moderate level of evidence, and then came to our integration of the evidence. On the y-axis, we have the human evidence, which was based on the Lam et al. Systematic review with that moderate level of evidence. We looked for whether there was any change in the level of evidence with an update with the 3 additional studies, and they really didn't change anything. They were mostly additional time points on existing cohorts that were captured. So they may have added a little, but they didn't change the overall level of evidence. It stayed as moderate in human evidence. And then for the animal studies, and that's supposed to be a rat swimming a Morris water maze. I have no idea if that's accurate. Dave would know. It was, again, a moderate level of evidence, which results in a presumed to be a hazard to humans. We then moved on to consider mechanistic data for whether or not that might increase or decrease our overall hazard conclusion. Very little is established as to the mechanism for this endocrine active, but neurological effect. So we really didn't have a lot to review there. There's a lot of potential mechanisms that might be involved, but you couldn't have a clear enough pathway to show a dose where the mechanistic data might be lower and give you increased confidence or the coherence between the human and the animal, some reason to bump it up. It just wasn't there. And so what I would like to say in closing is that we demonstrated that there are methods for using published systematic reviews, but they have to be critically assessed and updated, if appropriate, for EPA or other people's work. You saw an example for where there was less mechanistic data and heterogeneous, highly heterogeneous data. That's what you're likely to see with toxicological data, and you can still transparently demonstrate how your scientific judgment resulted in conclusions. And then finally, meta-analysis, which I did not show because that's really Dr. Chiu's field, and I would have badly butchered it. The meta-analysis was also useful for the PBDEs in order to evaluate the consistency, the effect sizes, the imprecision, etc., in the PBDE evaluation. And we would strongly support the meta-analysis. Okay, but the quick take-home. You guys are in the trenches doing the research. And for that research to be impactful, risk bias, clear demonstration of your study design and conduct so that you don't end up looking at a report and somebody used your data, you get really thrilled, and then you see the pink and the red, and you have to write somebody an email that says, why did you do that to my study? So fight with the journal authors and make sure you are very clear in the study design and conduct. And with that, I would like to recognize that this is obviously the committee's work and the extensive work of the NAS staff and the significant herding of cats by David. Thank you. I couldn't applaud for anybody else. I would say that applause goes across all the speakers.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. So we're going to invite our speakers here to take a seat, and we will be taking questions. I'm going to try to also bring up our other speakers if I can do so, and we will have a panel discussion. So there's questions.
Given that endocrine disruptors often exhibit non-monotonic dose responses, how did you use strength of dose response? Like, how did you assess that in this report?
Dave, do you want to address briefly just the history of the report which you touched on, and then the non-monotonic dose response?
So,
Dave, you might be muted.
Yes.
no, I don't know if I'm muted or not. Can you hear me?
I'm going to unmute all.
If you
I can hear you.
I'll start talking, but Dave, interrupt me otherwise.
Dr. Dorman, if you could unmute your line.
So I'm not muted.
I can hear him.
All right. Oh, I need to bring the volume back up. All right.
Dave?
So Dr. Dorman, if you don't mind trying again.
So I can try again. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Okay. So I guess that question has two different parts. So one part is unrelated to the low-dose endocrine report, and that's whether or not there's actually strong evidence of in vivo non-monotonic dose response curves. So I think we have to be really, really cautious about thinking that low-dose endocrine effects that get observed in vitro with non-monotonicity necessarily actually show up in the evidence in the in vivo data. And that was part of the non-monotonic dose response report that National Academy looked at as far as the white paper that EPA developed. That's not to say non-monotonic dose responses may not exist. It's just I think we need to just be sure that we understand that some endocrine disruptors may show monotonic responses, some may show non-monotonic. With respect to the way that we tried to handle questions related to non-monotonic, a lot of that was really based upon the meta-analyses that Dr. Chiu performed, where we were trying to look at the gross nature of the dose response curve, trying to determine if non-monotonicity actually was present with either the PBDEs or the phthalates was beyond the specific charge of our committee. But what we saw was no strong evidence within those data streams that within the species of interest, so within rodents, mice, rats, within humans, that we saw evidence that there was non-monotonicity. What we did observe is a disconnect between low dose responses seen in people in the EPI studies and much higher dose responses within animals, whether those could be kind of reconciled on a basis of pharmacokinetic data and other information that's still in part an open question. But when you start to think about the actual delivered dose to the tissues, that difference, a 100-fold difference to 1,000-fold differences, actually became quite a bit smaller.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
When you look at this PBDE, for the human study, you concluded that the evidence is moderate, and then animal study have a strong evidence, and then overall you concluded sufficient evidence. So can you talk a little bit about how can you make that conclusion, so sufficient evidence? So do you have any criteria?
Yeah, so I might kind of tag team with this with Dr. Rooney, because for our systematic review, we only looked at the human evidence. And then for the NAS report, they collectively looked at both human and So when we're looking at the human evidence, we ultimately said that there was moderate quality and then sufficient evidence of toxicity. And the way that you come to those conclusions is part of that process is kind of that 3-column approach, where you evaluate the risk of bias of individual studies and then evaluate the quality of the evidence using 6 or 7 different domains, and then that feeds into the strength of the evidence, 3 different domains. So I kind of skimmed over the details just for the interest of time here, but in our protocol, we have kind of rigid criteria where we make the definition of what level of evidence we would want to see and what aspects of the studies or the body of evidence we look at to come to those final conclusions. So there is kind of definitions of how each of those considerations are evaluated, and then how what you're seeing in the evidence kind of leads you to those final ratings. And each of those ratings also simultaneously come with their own definition for what constitutes moderate versus low versus high, and then sufficient versus limited versus evidence of lack of toxicity. So there's, I think, more information in the protocol, but also kind of rigid criteria so that when you look at that conclusion of sufficient, in and of itself, that doesn't really give partly a lot of information about what you saw in science. But when you're reading through the conclusions, there's kind of this background description of, okay, we say sufficient, but what do we mean by that? So we looked at, the potential studies and whether they accounted for all the confounders that we'd be concerned about, whether or not there were any sort of biases that might have affected the reports that were being estimated in the final effect estimates reported by these studies. If there's anything else that you might be concerned about. So there's different considerations that feed into that sufficient definition, but it is kind of intended to be a simple bottom line conclusion about the evidence. And then there's definitely more detail where an independent third party can see all of the different judgments that were made along the way to come to that final conclusion. Then maybe I'll turn it over to Dr. Rooney to talk about animals.
And so I appreciate that, and I have a lot of experience with the navigation guide, and I've been part of the group, and they've been just fantastic in how they develop their methods, and then we developed it shortly thereafter. So, but the quality in the navigation guide framework is certainty or confidence in the OHAT framework. That next step where Dr. Lam has explained they come up with sufficient is not a step that we have. We do consider some of those factors like the direction of the effect And we have our step, which is going from our confidence, same as their quality. And that's why we were able to take that moderate rating where the navigation guide left off, and then we took the data from the human study. We then considered the direction of the effect, and we implemented our hazard conclusion framework. It's simply a little bit different method. It does a few different things. One thing I didn't hear Dr. Lam emphasize is they looked at what kind of new data, what the impact of new data would be on their conclusions. How big of a negative study would it be to change their conclusion from that moderate and knock them off that conclusion? And it was pretty significant, right? And you could probably explain that better, but it's something that I wish we had in our method. We don't have it. It's simply a little bit different method. And so there's a lot of explaining about what we did, and it certainly doesn't help the policymakers if we're both at the table and they say, you guys came to different conclusions. We can't really explain it. It's a little bit different method.
Another question? Yeah.
I actually had two brief questions, if I may. The first one was, did any of you all have any core computational suites or informatic type suites that could help you maybe get the data and analyze higher throughput fashion? Or do you think that the data in general might be too hard to normalize because of how, and thinking about the strength of the data and of course all the different variables that were mentioned. And the second one was, if we find that these types of meta-analysis are required for confidence and for policy changes to be enacted, do you think that you might be able to actually go back and change the way that the literature and the journals require their sort of data to be inputted, like many other fields have certain standards for the experimental sections or in supplemental information and that sort of thing? I'm not too familiar with the state of the field. But
So two questions if you want to repeat that.
So I think you have about three questions that I'm going to answer, and I'm going to hand it off to Weihsueh about some of your computational techniques. I think the first one I would take as a question more about automated processes for searching the literature, for extracting data, for performing risk of bias. And we are actively engaged in pursuing automated processes for assisting with those methodologies. And there's a systematic review community that's working on automated methods. We have a challenge grant that we're trying to develop to get the people that are using computational methods into environmental health, so they try to answer our questions instead of gaming the stock market. Because we know that some of the techniques are out there, but it has to work for us. And so there's a very active group doing that. And they're also afraid of automated approaches to risk of bias because they want humans in there making the judgments, and yet there are some methods that have shown promise on. As far as the analysis, that would be Weihsueh's question. What was the last question that you were?
About the journals and changing.
The journals. Okay, so we're also actively involved. I'm imagining sitting at my desk upstairs from me back in North Carolina is environmental health perspectives. And so NIHS shepherds that journal, and they're actively trying to update their standards for reporting. We're putting more things into appendices, defining exactly if they accept a narrative review at all, and how that differs from a systematic review. Reporting requirements have been around for a decade or longer, such as the ARIVE guidelines, or I don't remember the reporting guidelines for human studies, but there's a number of them out there. They're having very little impact on the quality of reporting. I don't exactly know why. I think the journals are not then rejecting things that don't provide it, and they're not really facilitating it. But there's a couple of groups between Environment International and EHP that are trying to have a symposium next year to get these editors together and try to change the field. So a number of excellent suggestions, and there is work in all of those. And Weihsueh, if you want to try to answer what I think I heard was computational, and I shut up.
Yeah, I only caught about half of the question, like every other word. So it was, because I could hear Andy fine, but I think the audience, it's hard for me to hear. So if someone could repeat the question.
Do you want to go ahead and repeat your computational question, and I'll repeat it?
Sure. That was whether any of you all had found a use for the computational software as exists in bioinformatics and other types of data processing fields.
Meta-analysis, the meta-analysis portion.
Yeah, the meta-analysis portion itself, and sorting the data and sort of giving it some meaning prior to just looking at everything as a mess of literature.
So were you able to use computational software in the meta-analysis process, essentially? And could you elaborate on that a bit?
Right, so it was, the data was extracted using a pretty strict protocol from each study. And so once that took some time, and Dave did a bunch of it actually himself. But once what data was extracted, it just comes out in a spreadsheet, and there's pretty standard software already for doing meta-analysis, and that's what we chose to use. So it wasn't really raw data that we're extracting. We're extracting things like the mean, standard deviation, and kind of things for each group. So it wasn't really a highly informatic intensive kind of analysis. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
A lot of times for the human and animal evidence, unfortunately, you're not privy to a lot of the raw data, in which case if you had kind of a large data set that you're able to actually combine all of the individual data points into a model and then model that large data set, I think that would kind of be a different approach. But oftentimes, especially for human evidence, you're only able to see the effect estimates that are reported by the study investigators for a variety of reasons. So first, oftentimes it's a longitudinal study and they want to continue analyzing their own data. They don't want to give away the data that they've been slaving away for the last decade collecting, and then also for a lot of privacy reasons for human evidence. But as we're starting to get into more of the in vitro analyses where you have cellular data that is all kind of publicly open and available, that's when you start getting into these like bigger big data sets where you might have a lot of those computational informatic technologies and tools that you can start using to analyze those types of data sets. So I think we'll start seeing that more in the future, but it kind of depends on the type of data that you're looking at. So luckily for us, for the human FE, it doesn't require that advanced computational techniques because our group in particular does not have that expertise. But for those advanced data sets, I think we'll start seeing that more and more.
Great. So I think we have time for one final question. Kelly?
Curious about this point you just brought up, Dr. Lam, about some of the high throughput toxicant screening databases out there, like Tox20, Toxcast, and how those may be starting to be folded into these types of NIS reports, if they have yet, and where do you see that going?
So the question was, for some of the high throughput tox data, how is that starting to be folded into these types of reviews?
So for the NAS reports in general, I think there's been a lot of attention to high throughput data and how these types of data sets can start getting integrated into chemical assessments and to inform decisions. So there has been a couple of NAS reports that have already touched on these particular topics. In reference to kind of more the systematic review side, so in kind of the academic exercises of doing these systematic reviews, we've kind of punted on this to date. So the tools itself have been a process that's been developing since 2011. So we've been more focused on, okay, how do we apply these to human and animal evidence? And that question has been challenging in and of itself, that we've really focused on those two areas of those specific evidence streams. But for in vitro studies, certainly that plays a role, and there's a role in systematic review for integrating that stream of evidence. We haven't tackled it to date, and I think there are very few groups that have really thought cautiously about exactly how you're going to evaluate risk of bias for in vitro studies, or how you integrate that evidence, whether it's a separate stream or whether it's simply used to kind of upgrade or downgrade your final confidence level. that is still kind of an area of active debate, and maybe Dr. Rooney can talk a little bit more about how they're kind of evaluating that body of evidence. But it's definitely something where we have so much data that's coming out from this high throughput screening that we're going to have to address it at some point, but it hasn't happened to date. So in the next 5 or 10 years, hopefully we'll have a better process.
So
I think
I agree with everything that Dr. Lam said, but I would add that from the NTP National Toxicology Program perspective, so that we are part of Tox 21 and ToxCat, and we're trying to support and use that data to make decisions. And it's very difficult to consider it within this context because of the size of the data, the breadth of the data, and then the relevance of that to health effects. And so whether or not phenotypic anchoring is necessary. But we're struggling with that, and I mean, it's something that we would welcome a systematic review of somebody trying to make decisions that way. But one of the things that we did in the systematic review of immunotoxicity of PFOA and PFOS is that we had human evidence, animal evidence, and then I adapted a risk of bias approach from the experimental animals to consider in vitro exposures. And so we developed a risk of bias approach to evaluate the in vitro, and we used it on that PFOA evaluation. We haven't published it as a separate framework because we don't know if it's the best approach, but it's an approach. We used it on PFOA, and we, just as Dr. Lam emphasized, we consider that you could reach a conclusion on mechanistic data alone. Or you could consider the human and animal phenotypic data, which we're more comfortable with, and we can show how you would then consider mechanistic data on top of that, whether it would increase your confidence. Mechanistic data alone, we haven't done it. We'd like to see somebody try to do it, and we would strongly support methods development in that direction. Perhaps you.
Great. So on that note, I want to invite the audience to thank our speakers, and we will be joining next door for your unanswered questions. You'll have a chance over a reception to ask additional questions. So please join me to thank our speakers. And we especially appreciate our two remote speakers for staying with us on this really important topic and sharing their knowledge. So thank you again. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Sorry we couldn't be there in person.
And I concur with Weihsueh. I wish I was there in person, but enjoy the next few moments too. And thanks again.
Thank you so much. All right. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.